There was a time when dinner didn't take hours. It took 10 minutes, a few simple ingredients, and a whole lot of heart. Tonight, we're stepping back into American kitchens where families stretched every dollar and still created meals that felt warm, filling, and unforgettable. These are the forgotten suppers, cheap, quick, and quietly disappearing from memory. Some were born in hard times, others in busy households, but all of them tell a story. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe, because these lost recipes aren't just food, they're pieces of history waiting to be remembered again. The first forgotten supper begins with something so simple, it almost feels like it shouldn't matter, yet for many American families, it meant everything. Creamed chipped beef on toast, often quietly called SOS at the dinner table, was a meal born out of necessity, especially during the years surrounding the Great Depression and into World War II. It was cheap, quick, and relied on ingredients that could sit on a shelf for weeks without spoiling. In small kitchens across the country, mothers would stand over a stovetop, melting butter into a pan, stirring in flour to form a thick paste, then slowly pouring in milk to create a smooth, creamy gravy. The chipped beef, thin slices of salted, dried meat, would be rinsed to remove excess salt, then folded gently into the sauce. The smell alone was enough to bring everyone to the table. Toast was the foundation, often made from day-old bread that had gone slightly stale. Nothing was wasted. The warm, creamy beef mixture would be ladled generously over each slice, soaking into the bread and creating a dish that was both soft and hearty. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't beautiful. But it filled empty stomachs and stretched tight budgets. For many, this wasn't just a meal, it was survival served on a plate. Soldiers ate it in mess halls, children grew up with it as a weekly staple, and families leaned on it when money ran thin. It carried a quiet comfort, the kind that came not from luxury, but from reliability. Today, it's rarely seen on modern tables. Overshadowed by faster, flashier foods, this humble dish has slowly faded into memory. But once, in kitchens lit by dim bulbs and filled with quiet hope, creamed chipped beef on toast was more than dinner. It was proof that even in the hardest times, something warm and sustaining could still be made in just 10 minutes. The second forgotten supper begins with a sound many have long forgotten, the quiet crackle of sliced onions hitting a hot pan. Onion and hot dog skillet was never meant to be impressive. It was built for speed, for pennies, and for those evenings when there simply wasn't enough time or money for anything else. Yet somehow, it carried a flavor that lingered far beyond its humble ingredients. In post-war America, hot dogs weren't just ballpark food, they were a household staple. Affordable, easy to store, and endlessly adaptable, they became the backbone of many quick suppers. In small kitchens, a single pan would be set over the stove, and sliced onions would begin to soften in a bit of oil or leftover bacon grease. That smell alone, sweet, rich, and slightly smoky, would fill the room. Hot dogs, cut into coins or strips, would be tossed in next. As they browned, their edges crisping slightly, they absorbed the flavor of the onions. Some families added a splash of ketchup or a spoonful of mustard, while others kept it plain, letting the simplicity speak for itself. There were no strict rules, just whatever was on hand. Sometimes, it was served over a slice of toast. Other times, it was eaten straight from the pan, shared quickly before it could cool. It wasn't about presentation. It was about getting something warm on the table, fast. For children, it felt like a treat. For parents, it was a quiet relief, another meal made from almost nothing. It represented a kind of resourcefulness that defined an entire generation, where creativity in the kitchen wasn't optional, it was necessary. Today, dishes like this have nearly vanished, replaced by packaged meals and takeout boxes. But once, in homes where every minute and every coin mattered, onion and hot dog skillet was more than just a quick fix. It was a reminder that even the simplest ingredients could come together to create something satisfying, comforting, and just enough to get through another long day. The third forgotten supper begins in silence, the kind that settles in after a long day, when there's little energy left and even less in the pantry. Fried potato and egg scramble was the answer to that silence. It was never written in cookbooks or passed down with ceremony. It simply existed, quietly feeding families who needed something fast, filling, and dependable. Potatoes were always there. Cheap, sturdy, and able to last through the week, they became the backbone of countless meals. In many American kitchens, they were peeled quickly, sometimes not at all, and sliced thin before hitting a hot pan with a bit of oil or saved drippings. The sizzle was immediate, sharp, and promising. Slowly, the edges would turn golden, crisping just enough to add texture. Then came the eggs. Cracked directly into the pan, they would spread and settle between the potatoes, binding everything together. Some stirred them quickly into a scramble, while others let them sit just long enough to form soft layers. A pinch of salt, maybe a bit of pepper if it was available, that was all it needed. There was no waiting, no extra steps. Within minutes, it was ready. Scooped onto a plate or eaten straight from the skillet, it offered a warmth that went beyond its ingredients. It filled the room with a quiet comfort, the kind that didn't need explanation. For many families during the Depression and the years that followed, this wasn't just a quick supper, it was a reliable fallback. When meat was scarce or budgets were stretched thin, potatoes and eggs stepped in without complaint. They turned scarcity into something satisfying. Today, it's easy to overlook a dish like this. It feels too simple, too ordinary for modern tastes. But once, in homes where every meal mattered, fried potato and egg scramble was more than just food. It was a moment of relief, a pause in the struggle, and a reminder that even the most basic ingredients could still bring a sense of fullness and quiet peace. The fourth forgotten supper begins with the soft hiss of a pan and the unmistakable scent of something being stretched just a little further than it should. Cornbread and milk skillet was not a recipe you planned. It was one you turned to when the cupboard felt nearly empty and the day had already taken too much. In many Southern homes, cornbread was made almost daily. It was cheap, filling, and dependable. But what made this supper unique was what happened to the leftovers. Instead of being thrown away, yesterday's cornbread was crumbled directly into a warm skillet, sometimes with a small pat of butter if it could be spared. The pieces would toast lightly, edges crisping while the inside stayed soft. Then came the milk. Poured slowly over the crumbled cornbread, it would soak in, turning the dish into something between a savory pudding and a soft, comforting mash. Some families preferred it slightly dry, others let it sit until every bite was fully saturated. There were no strict measurements, just instinct and necessity guiding each step. For a touch of flavor, a pinch of salt might be added, or a spoonful of sugar if someone wanted to turn it into something sweeter. Occasionally, if times were better, a bit of bacon grease would find its way into the pan, giving the entire dish a rich, smoky depth. It came together in minutes. No waiting, no complexity, just a warm, humble meal that could be eaten quietly at the table or straight from the skillet. For children, it was familiar. For parents, it was a way to make something out of almost nothing. This dish carried the weight of hard times, especially during the Great Depression, when wasting food simply wasn't an option. Every crumb had value, every meal had purpose. Today, cornbread and milk skillet has nearly disappeared, replaced by more polished recipes and modern conveniences. But once, in kitchens where survival depended on creativity, it was more than just supper. It was proof that even leftovers could be transformed into something warm, filling, and deeply comforting in just 10 minutes. The fifth forgotten supper begins with a single can sitting quietly on a shelf, unassuming, overlooked, but once essential. Tomato soup and crackers wasn't just a light meal. For many American families, it was a lifeline during long, uncertain days when money was tight and time was even tighter. In kitchens across the country, a pot would be placed on the stove, and a can of condensed tomato soup would be opened with a familiar metallic click. Water or milk, whichever was available, was stirred in, thinning the rich, deep red into something warm and ready within minutes. As it heated, the scent would rise gently, slightly sweet, slightly tangy, filling the room with a quiet sense of comfort. But the real substance came from the crackers. Saltines, cheap and long-lasting, were crushed by hand and dropped into the soup just before eating. They softened quickly, soaking up the warmth and transforming the thin soup into something far more filling. Each spoonful carried a mix of smooth broth and softened bites, simple yet satisfying. There were small variations, of course. Some added a knob of butter for richness, watching it melt slowly across the surface. Others sprinkled a bit of pepper or paired it with a slice of bread if they had it. But most kept it plain, trusting the simplicity to do its job. This wasn't a meal meant to impress, it was meant to sustain. During the Great Depression and well into the mid-20th century, it became a dependable fallback, something families could rely on when options were few. It asked for almost nothing and gave back just enough. For children, it was warm and familiar. For parents, it was reassurance that, at least for tonight, there was something to serve. Today, tomato soup and crackers is often dismissed as too basic, too ordinary to matter. But once, in homes where every meal carried weight, it was more than just a quick supper. It was comfort in its simplest form, ready in 10 minutes, quietly holding families together through difficult times. The sixth forgotten supper begins with the scrape of a spoon against a nearly empty jar. Peanut butter on warm toast might seem too simple to matter, but for countless American families, it was a dependable meal when time was short and cupboards were running low. It required no stove beyond a quick toast, no planning, and almost no cost, yet it carried a quiet kind of comfort that made it unforgettable. Bread was always the base. Sliced, often slightly stale, it would be placed into a toaster or onto a pan until the edges turned crisp and golden. The heat mattered. It transformed what came next. As soon as the toast was ready, a thick layer of peanut butter would be spread across the surface. The warmth softened it instantly, turning it smooth and slightly glossy, melting just enough to seep into every corner. In some homes, that was enough. The rich, nutty flavor and the crunch of the toast created a meal that was both quick and satisfying. But others added small touches when they could, a drizzle of honey for sweetness, a sprinkle of sugar, or even thin slices of banana if they happened to be on hand. Each variation depended on what was available, not what was ideal. There was no waiting. Within minutes, it was ready to eat, often held in one hand, eaten quietly at the table or even standing in the kitchen. For children, it felt familiar and filling. For adults, it was a practical solution, something reliable when the day had already taken too much. During difficult years, especially the Depression era and wartime rationing, meals like this became more than just a quick fix. They were a form of stability, offering nourishment without strain. Today, peanut butter toast is often seen as a snack, something too small to count as a meal. But once, in homes where simplicity was a necessity, it stood on its own. It proved that even the most basic ingredients could come together in 10 minutes to create something warm, sustaining, and quietly enough. The seventh forgotten supper begins with the quiet clatter of a single pot and the promise of making something out of almost nothing. Macaroni and stewed tomatoes was a dish that didn't rely on meat, didn't demand expensive ingredients, and yet somehow managed to feel complete. It was a staple in many American homes, especially when budgets were tight and time was short. Dry macaroni, inexpensive and easy to store, would be dropped into boiling water and cooked until just tender. There was no need for perfection, just enough softness to carry the dish. Once drained, it went straight back into the pot, still warm, still waiting. Then came the tomatoes. Often from a can, stewed tomatoes were poured in, bringing a deep, slightly sweet acidity that transformed the plain pasta. As the mixture heated together, the sauce thickened slightly, clinging to every piece of macaroni. The color alone, rich red against pale pasta, made it feel more substantial than it really was. Some families added a small pat of butter, letting it melt into the tomatoes for a smoother texture. Others sprinkled in salt, pepper, or even a pinch of sugar to balance the acidity. There were no strict instructions, only small adjustments based on taste and what was available in the moment. It came together quickly, often in the same pot, minimizing both effort and cleanup. Bowls were filled generously, steam rising as it was carried to the table. It wasn't fancy and it certainly wasn't modern, but it did what it needed to do. It filled stomachs and brought a sense of warmth to the room. For many, this dish became a quiet tradition, repeated week after week without much thought. It was reliable, predictable, and comforting in its simplicity. Today, macaroni and stewed tomatoes has nearly faded from memory, replaced by richer, more complex pasta dishes. But once, in kitchens where simplicity ruled, it was more than just supper. It was proof that even the most basic pantry staples could come together in 10 minutes to create something hearty, familiar, and enough to carry a family through the night. The eighth forgotten supper begins with a skillet, a handful of flour, and the quiet knowledge that something filling can still be made from almost nothing. Milk gravy over toast was one of those meals that appeared without warning, usually on nights when the pantry offered little more than basics. It wasn't planned, and it certainly wasn't celebrated, but it was dependable. A bit of fat, sometimes butter, sometimes leftover drippings, would be melted in a pan. Flour was stirred in, forming a thick paste that cooked just long enough to lose its raw taste. Then came the milk, poured slowly, stirred constantly, transforming the mixture into a smooth, pale gravy. It thickened quickly, turning rich and creamy within minutes. There was no meat in this version, no extras to dress it up. Just a pinch of salt, maybe a bit of pepper if it was on hand. The flavor was mild, almost plain, but that was part of its purpose. It was meant to stretch, to fill, to provide warmth without demanding much in return. Toast was prepared alongside it, simple slices of bread browned until crisp. Once ready, the gravy was poured generously over the top, soaking into every corner. The bread softened beneath the weight of it, turning each bite into something tender and easy to eat. For families during the hardest years, especially throughout the Depression, this dish was a quiet solution. It asked for ingredients that were almost always available and turned them into something that felt like a proper meal. It didn't rely on abundance, it relied on creativity. Children often grew up with this taste, familiar and comforting, while parents saw it as another small victory, another night where everyone was fed. Today, milk gravy over toast is rarely remembered, often overshadowed by richer, more elaborate dishes. But once, in homes where simplicity was survival, it was more than just supper. It was a reminder that even the plainest ingredients could come together in 10 minutes to create something warm, steady, and just enough to keep going. The ninth forgotten supper begins with the faint aroma of frying onions and the soft hiss of a hot skillet. Ham and potato hash was never glamorous, but in countless American kitchens, it was a lifesaver, quick, cheap, and filling enough to satisfy hungry families after long days of work. It was the kind of dish that took leftovers and transformed them into something that felt brand new. Potatoes were the backbone. Peeled or unpeeled, cubed or sliced, they hit the hot pan first, sizzling as they browned along the edges. The smell alone, earthy, warm, and slightly sweet, would signal that dinner was on the way. Onions followed, sliced thin, softening and caramelizing as they mingled with the potatoes, adding depth and subtle sweetness. Then came the ham, often left over from a Sunday meal or an economical purchase earlier in the week. Cut into small pieces, it was stirred in, browning slightly and releasing its smoky, salty flavor. Some families added a dash of pepper or a sprinkle of paprika if they had it, but the dish was flavorful enough on its own. Everything cooked together for just a few minutes, the ingredients mingling and forming a rustic, hearty hash. It wasn't fancy. It didn't need presentation or perfection. It was meant to fill stomachs and warm hearts. Bowls were filled quickly, sometimes eaten right from the skillet, the steam rising as families gathered around the table. For parents, it was a practical solution, a way to stretch leftovers and create a full meal in 10 minutes. For children, It was comfort food, savory and satisfying in every bite. Today, ham and potato hash has largely disappeared from American dinner tables, overshadowed by more modern, convenient meals. But once, in homes where every bit of food mattered, it was more than just supper. It was proof that even scraps and simple staples could be transformed into something nourishing, filling, and delicious in just minutes, keeping families fed through the daily grind. The 10th forgotten supper begins with a sound many modern kitchens rarely hear: the gentle bubbling of beans on a stovetop. Beans and cornbread casserole was never flashy, never meant to impress. But for countless American families, it was a humble hero, cheap, quick, and endlessly comforting, turning simple ingredients into a meal that could feed a family in just 10 minutes of final preparation. Dried or canned beans were the starting point. If using canned, they were drained and rinsed. If dried, they had been soaked earlier, ready to cook. In a skillet or small pot, the beans were heated gently, often with a splash of the water they were cooked in, until soft and tender. The aroma, earthy, hearty, and reassuring, filled the kitchen, signaling that supper was almost ready. Cornbread, often a leftover from earlier in the week, was crumbled into the beans, letting it absorb the moisture and thicken the dish. Sometimes a bit of butter or bacon grease was added, enriching the texture and flavor. The cornbread softened, blending into the beans to create a warm, cohesive casserole. A pinch of salt, a dash of pepper, or even a sprinkle of sugar could enhance the taste, depending on what the family had on hand. This dish wasn't just about filling bellies. It was about making the most of what was available, stretching every ingredient to its limit, and creating something satisfying from the simplest of components. Children often enjoyed it for its hearty texture, while parents appreciated its reliability on busy evenings. Over time, beans and cornbread casserole faded from American tables, replaced by faster or more elaborate meals. But in kitchens where thrift and practicality ruled, it was more than a supper. It was sustenance, comfort, and resourcefulness all in one. In just 10 minutes, leftovers and staples transformed into a warm, filling meal, reminding families that even the humblest ingredients could carry weight, flavor, and the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. And there you have it, 10 forgotten American suppers that prove simplicity can be extraordinary. These meals weren't about fancy ingredients or complicated techniques. They were about warmth, comfort, and making the most of what was on hand. Each dish carries a story of resilience, resourcefulness, and the quiet creativity of families who cooked with love under tight budgets and busy schedules. By revisiting these lost recipes, we honor the kitchens and hands that kept families fed and hearts full. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to subscribe and keep America's lost flavors alive.